My name is Mike Usrey, and today on FM Live we're going to talk about a very misunderstood and often questioned what the heck is it and why is it there system on Miatas, and it is the evaporative emissions system. So evaporative emissions, that sounds like a big term for something that's actually pretty simple. In short, evaporative emissions has to do with fuel fumes coming from the fuel in your gas tank. So fuel fumes are something that basically they're an unintentional side effect of filling up your car with gasoline. Anytime you have some kind of a container holding some kind of gasoline or volatile fuel, it will start to emit gases at a certain temperature and even just at a certain pressure. So those gases, they need to be handled in a safe manner. Way back in the 70s, around I think 75 or 76, the California Air Resources Board actually instituted an evaporative emissions standard, so that way any road-going vehicle that was introduced in California and then throughout the rest of the nation at that point, and even other parts of the world, of course, start to have these systems on board the cars called evaporative emission systems. And they're designed to handle those fumes and not let them just waft away into the atmosphere. So this is all based on making sure that we keep the planet green and that when you're driving around it's as not stinky as possible, is the short story. We don't want those fumes to just get put out into the air for everybody to breathe and have to deal with. So this is something that has to do with government involvement, of course, but in the long run, it's not actually a bad thing. It is a good thing. It doesn't rob horsepower, and we'll get into a little bit more about the system and how it affects your engine in just a little bit. But in short, an evaporative emission system, it will have fittings from the fuel tank going up to the engine, and that allows those fuel vapors to be sucked into the engine and burned rather than just released into the atmosphere. That's the whole job of the evaporative emission system, is to basically use them as fuel rather than wasting and polluting your clean air. So let's talk about the base components individually of an evaporative emission system. Before I get into that, actually, I will remind you that this is a live video, so if you have questions and I don't answer it, or if you see something on the table or in our examples that you have questions about, feel free to drop us a comment in the comment section and I'll try to get to as many as possible throughout the video. Firstly, in an evaporative emission system, we do have where everything starts, the fuel tank. I don't have one to show you because they're big and awkward and they're kind of hard to take out of the car. But you get the idea. You go to the gas station, you pop the cap, you stick the filler in, and fuel starts to flow into the fuel tank in the vehicle. That's where it all begins. And the reason why these gases exist to begin with is because gasoline is a very compound and complicated fuel mixture, if you will. And at, I think, the initial boiling point, because it's a complicated mixture or liquid, not just like water that's a really simple liquid, it actually begins to boil off some of the more volatile chemicals or components in gasoline at about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's roughly about 35 degrees centigrade. And this is just, normal temperature. Of course, if you're in the summertime, it's easier to see or easier to get these fumes. Just imagine what adding an exhaust that runs underneath your fuel tank will do to heat up the fuel, or any of your running gear like your differential or drive shaft or components that are moving that do heat up too. So it's pretty easy to see that your fuel tank, which is usually next to most of those components, and especially in the summertime when it's hot, it will start to heat up that fuel, and fumes will then start to come off of the liquid gasoline and be building up in the tank. Well, you can't just leave them there. They have to go somewhere because fumes will create pressure, and obviously a pressurized canister full of combustible fuel is kind of a bad deal. So in order to deal with that, it needs to go somewhere. In the evaporative emissions system, there will be hoses coming off of that fuel tank that generally first are going to run up towards the front of the car, in a general sense, towards the engine. And usually, actually, let's walk over here to the board. I'll show you what is a normal setup on most vehicles. By the way, this was drawn by the most talented fifth grader we could find. So excuse the slightly less than accurate proportions. But we have our fuel tank hose coming out, and a lot of times there will be a check valve involved. And this is to indicate that the fuel vapor pressure is allowed to escape from the tank, but there isn't anything that's allowed to go back into the tank. It's only able to release pressure, not to have anything go back the other direction. After that, and this isn't true with all cars, if you have an earlier NA Miata, you won't actually have this, but a lot of cars, newer cars, will have some kind of a filter. And this is going to be some kind of usually a black canister that's got usually some kind of a cloth or similar media in it that is something that vapors can pass through, but solids cannot. So if there were any kind of like junk floating around in your fuel tank and they managed to get sloshed up there, that filter would catch them and just let the fumes pass through. From there, oftentimes there will be a charcoal canister, usually in the engine bay, just before the engine, and that charcoal canister is literally a canister full of activated carbon or charcoal, basically. What this does is it acts as a holding tank because those fumes need somewhere to go, and they're not always going to go into the engine at any given time. More on that in just a second. So think of this like a surge tank, I suppose you could think of like a normal liquid fuel system. This is just a holding canister, so that way when the engine is ready to accept those fumes and burn them, there's actually a solenoid that controls when that passage opens up to allow those fumes to get sucked into your engine. This is an intake, in case you couldn't tell. Gets sucked into your intake via a little vacuum port usually, and while the engine is running, it's just sucking in those fumes and it will burn them along with normal combustion. In a nutshell, you're just a path in this system to get those fumes to the engine to burn them. So another thing to note is that, as I mentioned, some of these things aren't present on the earlier models, and actually the later you go, this does get more complicated and there's more things involved, such as sometimes there's a secondary charcoal canister for even more capacity, or sometimes there is an extra little pump, usually about here on the NBs and later cars too, that is a leak detection pump. It'll actually slightly pressurize, it'll be after the check valve, it'll slightly pressurize this circuit so that way if there is any kind of leak, it'll know because that pump will keep running. It's intended to pump up to a certain pressure and then turn off. So if you get a check engine light for a evaporative emissions system leak, it's usually because that pump is working when it shouldn't have to try to keep a little bit of pressure in this system because it's looking for leaks. There's other things involved, but generally speaking, all cars are going to have some format of this, or at least let's say all Miatas. I guess I can't speak for all cars, but since 1975-6, any car sold in California and then in the rest of America is going to have something that looks something like this. So, in a nutshell, we're just getting those fumes up to the engine to get them burned. That's all it's doing. Now that we've talked about some of the routing here, let's go back over here to the bench and I'll show you some of the individual components, because this is what most people have questions about and want to see a little bit more about what they do and how they do it. So the first thing that most people are probably familiar with, and this is from an NB, but even the NAs will look very similar, is the charcoal canister. It's this little, usually black plastic canister. It'll have a few ports. This is usually mounted in the engine bay. NBs do have a secondary one, or I guess you could call it a primary one, that's under the car, kind of where the fuel filter lives. But normally this is the one that most people are concerned about because it's what you see when you pop the hood. And actually we'll go over and look at under the hood of Ron here in just a second so you can see what it looks like in case it doesn't ring any bells. But this canister is where all of your activated carbon lives, or charcoal basically, and this is what your holding tank is, or kind of a surge tank for those fumes. And I've actually gone through the effort of cutting one open. This is from an NA Miata. We'll stop right here to say, don't do this at home, please. While I wouldn't say that it's a terribly dangerous thing to do, having any kind of charcoal dust in the air and breathing it is bad for you, so don't do this, or if you do, make sure you're very well protected and in a ventilated space, all of that stuff. But anyway, This is just kind of gravelly or small gravel, sandy kind of bits of charcoal. And charcoal is a great media for absorbing all kinds of different pollutants or different both vapors and liquids for what it's worth. So you'll see activated carbon used in a lot of different instances besides just charcoal canisters. If you have a water filter at home, oftentimes it's filled with something very similar to this, or at least, activated carbon of some nature. But this is used all over the world for all kinds of different filtration purposes. But in this instance, not only does it help filter some of the yuck stuff out, but it also acts as a storage container capsule. Fumes will actually get absorbed into the material itself, and then whenever it's necessary for them to get sucked into the engine, they can be released via that solenoid that we talked about earlier. Speaking of which, this is usually what they look like. So this little solenoid is from, I think, an NB. The NAs will look very, very similar to this as well, but in short, it'll be a little black electronics box. It's got a couple of ports on it, and all it's doing is acting as an open-closed gate. So when the solenoid is powered, it allows fumes to go through. That way they can get sucked into the engine, but otherwise the gate is closed, so that way all of those fumes, just get sucked into the charcoal canister and stored until they're ready to be used. So let's talk about that. When does an engine normally allow the fumes to go through the evaporative emission system to get sucked into the engine and burnt up? Goodness, this fly is very interested in the charcoal. That normally happens. The solenoid is usually turned on to allow fumes to pass into the engine whenever the engine is experiencing low load, cruising, or usually just like low speed or medium, I guess moderate speed probably, conditions. So it's not going to happen generally when you're doing any kind of power. Like if you're in, say, you have a highly modified Miata and you're in boost, wide open throttle, whatever, this is not going to come on, because this is not intended to do anything as far as adding power or subtracting power or anything like that. This is only to get rid of those fumes, and so it's only going to do that when the engine isn't busy trying to do other things like make lots of horsepower. So if you're cruising along 45, 50 miles an hour or something like that, and you're just keeping the throttle real level and even, oftentimes those kinds of conditions, when the engine's not being asked of much, that's when this is going to allow those fumes to get sucked into the engine and be burned. Of course, the ECU knows this. It's actually the one telling this solenoid to do anything. So it's going to adjust the air-fuel ratio that the injectors are trying to match with the rest of the intake to accommodate for those fuel vapors, because they are also, or the vapor is also a fuel. So that is all controlled by the engine control unit, or the ECU, and it knows what's going on, so it's going to level out its fuel needs versus what air is coming into the engine at those specific times. Beyond that, as I mentioned, I did cut one of these guys open. I should also note that basically there's an in and an out. That material is held in here. It's got actually some kind of paper, foamy material that holds in place. But you can also notice on this guy, there is another port, and this would actually be on the bottom. The NBs don't have it on their in-engine bay canister, but we'll talk about different variants in just a moment. This guy is normally used on NAs because it has a hose that goes down into the frame rail that acts as a source for a vacuum effect to take place. So there is a check valve either in the bottom of this canister, I think, or in the line itself, so that way when the solenoid opens up and it wants to suck in some of that air, it would be difficult if this was a completely closed system, or even if it was still trying to pull some of the fumes from the tank. So one of the ways it helps to encourage those fumes to come into the intake is that this hose ran into the frame rail, just basically somewhere protected that it's not going to suck in debris and bugs and whatnot. It will allow some air to pass through fresh air along with the fumes into the intake, so that way it's drawing those fumes out and kind of helping to clean out some of the fumes in the activated charcoal at the same time. NBs look a little bit different, but they have a very similar kind of effect. It just isn't built the same way. Remember, the check valves are all necessary so that way those fumes don't get out of the system, that they go directly into the engine to be burned. Let's see. That covers all of the components in a nutshell. So I think at this point, let's move on to some of the questions, because now that we know what a evaporative emission system does, let's see what people want to do with them, because there's actually quite a few questions about what can be done. First one talks about maintenance and longevity. Is it true that they become useless over time, you know, after 10, 20, 30, whatever years? Basically, this carbon, activated carbon, it does have a lifespan. Over a certain amount of time, it will have absorbed as much either contaminants or even basically worn itself out, and it's not able to absorb and then emit those fumes as well as it used to when it was new and fresh. So technically, yes, it does have a lifespan. It will eventually wear out. So what happens when your charcoal canister doesn't work very well? Well, actually, the reason why this one is cut open is because this bag of charcoal is pretty heavy. You know, they're different sizes, but this is probably 3, 4, 5 times as heavy as this, because this came out of an early NA6 and it's been in service for a long time, and it's actually absorbed a lot of fuel vapors and I think even raw fuel. Now, how might raw fuel get into your charcoal canister? That usually happens whenever you're at the gas pump. You've got your filler stuck into the filler neck on your car, and you let her rip. It fills up, it goes click, and it turns off. And then you say, I don't believe you. I think there's more room. So you go click, and it turns off. And you say, no, you're not quite full yet. And then you pull it again, and you do that multiple times. What happens is that on the fuel tank, because that port is high up on the tank, it's intended when the fuel cutoff happens, I should have drawn it on there actually, on your fuel filler neck there's a second breather hose, and it knows whenever your tank is full. And so that's what tells the gun to turn off and stop filling up your fuel tank. If you ignore that and you keep adding fuel, you will actually fill your fuel tank up to the point where it gets to that outlet in your evaporative emission system, and then you'll actually get raw liquid fuel into your evaporative emission system, and it will get passed up to eventually the charcoal canister usually, and then raw fuel will basically get absorbed into your charcoal, and it takes up a lot more volume and essentially makes your charcoal, your activated carbon, or activated charcoal, sorry, much less useful at that point. So that's probably why this is so heavy. And it was also very stinky when it was removed from the car, which is another sign that likely your charcoal canister is not doing as much as it used to. Or another common question is, you know, why is my engine bay so stinky? These guys are plastic, and occasionally they will crack. So oftentimes it'll be because one of these nipples for the hoses gets bumped, and then there's a crack because it's just hanging on by a thread. Or sometimes the actual housing will develop a crack because, who knows, maybe you were installing a new shock tower brace in your engine bay, and then you accidentally dropped the big brace and it fell on your plastic charcoal canister and broke it, you know, something like that. Oftentimes it's not that obvious. Sometimes, like on the NBs, they have a lower cap that is held on with like some kind of epoxy, and that epoxy will degrade over time, and then you'll develop a leak here at this seam, and you won't even know it because it's not that visible. So stuff like that, broken or old canisters that are starting to leak, will cause a fuel smell because they're basically letting that vapor that was trapped in there out into your engine bay. That can also happen with any of the hoses that attach onto any of these components. They're rubber, they'll wear out, they'll get cracked, or they'll get cut, or something like that. And of course, that means fuel vapors are allowed to escape. So things like that are common reasons why you might smell fuel in your engine bay, or maybe even as you're driving down the road with the top down or something like that. So if you do smell raw fuel, but you're not seeing fuel leaks at like your fuel rail or something like that, check your charcoal canister, check your solenoids, check all of the plastic, all the rubber, that kind of stuff. You'll usually find the problem because something is cracked or broken. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. One of the questions we got was that say you bought a car, a used Miata, NA, NB, whatever, and somebody has already removed this from the engine bay and you want to be able to replace it. Or say that you think yours is cracked or filled up with raw fuel and it's not really doing anything anymore. How do you go about replacing it? Truth be told, I don't think that Mazda offers these new anymore. I haven't looked for all the different year ranges, but oftentimes they are difficult to come across. If you can find one from your local Mazda dealer, that is your best bet because that means that it's new, it hasn't had any vapors through it, it will obviously last longer than if you were to go out and just get a used one from a junkyard. That being said, if your option is that you cannot find new, you might try to find a used one at a junkyard because if it is a car that had low mileage or something like that, it will probably still last you a good long time. Any charcoal canister or other broken component that you need to replace, that if you replace it with another one, even if it's used, is better than a broken, cracked one. So functional, even used, is better than not functional, no matter what we're talking about for the most part. For what it's worth, because I know these are pretty difficult to come across, if you're, sorry about watching it live, but if you're watching this not live, I will post links to some of our favorite salvage parts dealers. So that way, if you need to go to hold of something like this, they'll be good resources for those of you that do need to get a hold of some. So, speaking of those people that decide to remove or want to remove their evaporative emission system, why might you do that? Well, let's go take a look at the engine bay, because I think the most common reason most people want to remove them is because they take up quite a bit of real estate under the hood. And let's be honest, they're not the most attractive systems to look at. So on our project car run here, you can see the charcoal canister right here. And here's our little solenoid I was just pointing out earlier. And then all of these hoses are part of the evaporative emission system. Now, this stuff back here is not, so don't worry about that stuff. That's mostly stock fuel system and a few extra wires that we've added. But all of this takes up real estate, and it's kind of relatively unattractive components. I think, and most of the questions we get are revolving around, I'd like to clean up my engine bay. How can I move this or get rid of it because it looks ugly? Fair, it is not the most attractive. So, can you remove it? Let's just say the correct answer is no. Legally speaking, federal emissions requires that you keep the evaporative emission system in place. If you remove it, one, you're tampering with that emission system, and that makes all kinds of emissions facilities and entities very unhappy with your choices. Two, where are those fumes going to go now? Remember how we talked about that solenoid being used for only letting those fumes into the engine at a certain point or certain time under certain conditions? Well, you can't just plumb everything with just a hose and expect it to work and keep the engine and the ECU happy. So you do need most of the components even to just function properly. You can't just run a hose. Well, what if I just unplug it at the tank or under the car and just let those fumes escape into the atmosphere? Well, technically you can. Your car will be very stinky. It will probably give you a check engine light because that would be a leak in your evaporative emission system. And then again, any kind of emissions testing facility and the rest of the government basically are going to be very angry with you for removing that component. So I would not recommend that you remove your evaporative emission system. It's there because it needs to be, not because Mazda wanted to throw ugly stuff in your engine bay. Now, what about the possibility of moving components out of the engine bay? Okay, so this is a more plausible scenario as long as you know what you're doing. Because Your charcoal canister and your solenoid, they don't have to live right there to function. So if you wanted to, had some fabrication skills, you could potentially move this charcoal canister and the solenoid and maybe some of the hoses somewhere that's less visible. Maybe you have room under your intake manifold. Maybe you have some room behind your headlight. Maybe you have some room in the bumper cover or even underneath the car back by the fuel filter. So can you do it? Sure. The problem though with that is that you need to make sure that your routing stays the same. Otherwise, if you botch up your different hose locations, you're going to probably cause problems for yourself. And the hoses themselves, of course, they are a formed hose for most of these, so they have the right bends to live where they're supposed to live. But they are very specific kinds of hoses. They aren't just your normal 5/16, hose on a reel that you can get from AutoZone, Napa, whatever. They are rated specifically for fuel vapor. That's important. So if you're going to go do that and reorganize where these components live, you can get the order right, get the correct hose that's rated for fuel vapor, and then make sure that after everything is mounted, that it's securely mounted. Make sure that you don't get a check engine light, test it, all that kind of stuff. Keep an eye on it. I'm not going to tell you how to do all of those things specifically because, for one, we're more interested with performance and horsepower, and there's some shiny stuff in the engine bay, and that keeps us happy enough. I don't have a step-by-step tutorial for you to reroute or relocate your components. The other part of that is that a lot of times those fuel vapor rated hoses, to get them and get enough length to make it worth your while, can be expensive. So that's another reason why we generally don't even bother moving them around. They're fine where they are for us, but you can make that decision on your own if you'd like to do that. So I probably beat that dead horse enough. Let's move on to the next one. Is there a nicer looking aftermarket option? Okay, so this is kind of another facet of that. Truth be told, I have not shopped around for an aftermarket canister that looks nicer. Again, we like engine bling and engine bay bling, but not enough to spend money on a functional component that's doing just fine. So if there is, I don't have a recommendation for you. I would be surprised if there's much out there because this has nothing to do with making horsepower. So I would imagine most aftermarket companies are not producing charcoal canisters or solenoids that are prettier looking. But the internet's a big wide place, so go have a look. And let's see. I think that that's probably about it. So I'll stop here. I think that's all of the questions that I had lined up before the video started. And I'll check and see if we have any questions that popped up while we were doing the video. Or have I answered them all? Okay, all right. Well, that's good news. I was long-winded, and hopefully that means that I answered all of the questions. If you do have questions after this video is posted to our YouTube, feel free to comment down below, or you can reach out to us via email at support@flymiata.com, or you can also give us a call at 970-464-5600, and one of our helpful customer support reps will be happy to talk to you more and more about your evaporative emission system, and of course many other things. So, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you learned something. If you did, click the like button. Maybe share this video if this is something that you and your friends have discussions about, what should be done with your evaporative emission system. And of course, if you have suggestions about what other topics you'd like to hear us discuss in the future, drop those down in the comments below because we would love to see what you would like to hear and like to see because we have lots to talk about. As always, thanks again for watching. We will see you in the next episode. We will catch you same time next week. Thanks again. My name is Mike. Have a great day.